thanks to you all for carving out a time on a Friday to be here with us. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so you could see my PowerPoint with some of the images and the poem that I'm going to be talking about today. So my book, as Dan was mentioning, is called Sadistic Chola, Sex and Violence in Contemporary Peru. The book theorizes the longue durée of racial signifiers, in particular Chola, and their contemporary uses for trans feminist authors, artists, scholars, and activists. When hearing the word Cholo in the US context, what comes to mind are the Mexican subcultures of LA. The South American Cholo is not the same. Cholo or Chola has been used mostly as an insult to refer to indigenous-looking people in urban settings. To elaborate on contemporary migration to Lima, Aníbal Quijano draws on el Inca Garcilaso de la Vega 16th century definition of Cholo as the son of mulattoes, who are themselves the result of the mix between Indio or India and Black peoples. Cholo means vile mutt, which makes the Chola quite literally a bitch. Since colonial times, Chola as a racial slur has served to stigmatize women as sexually promiscuous, prone to sex with white men and foreigners, reproducing the impurities of the mestizo race. In my research, I examine race as a key yet overlooked component of the massive participation of women in the insurgencies during Peru's internal war of the 80s, when the Maoist Shining Path declared war to the Peruvian state. Women were more than 40% of the militants. I argued that women's use of armed violence opened up a spectrum for new forms of embodying politics, sexuality, and gender, changing the meaning of the main racial signifiers assigned to them: Chola, Mestiza, and India. My work also locates sadism as an aesthetic and political tool that articulates violence, sexual desire, and politics, unsettling the traditional positionalities for racialized women within the libidinal economy of Peru's neocolonial situation during the war and also the post-war. The resignification of Chola has become paramount to understand Peruvian trans-feminist organizing, in particular those that sustain a critical view of white criollo feminist discourses. I situate these ideas in relation to the work of trans as cisgender women authors, artists, performers, and activists. Collectives such as Comando Plath and Chola Contravisual, the work of artist Winnie Minerva, and the music of Afro-Peruvian performer Diana are some of the main actors I analyze in order to show the deft maneuverings of sadistic representations in Chola aesthetics. Their productions range from representations of the 80s war to the current denunciation of feminicide, sexual violence, racism, misogyny, and transphobia that coalesce in the massive region-wide Ni Una Menos uprisings of 2016. So, to consider the specificity of a feminist aesthetic in regard to the war, I now turn into today's talk, Terruquearse, the Politics of Chola Self-Representation. Here I look into visual artist Claudia Coca and poet activist Roxana Crisologo's use of representation to interrogate the libidinal economy of the war and in reference to armed women. Their works challenge the dominant representation of subversive women, almost always presented as radically other, bloodthirsty, hypersexualized cholas or butch-looking Maoist fanatics, in some as savages deserving of public condemnation. While police repression and social surveillance reinforce the need to separate oneself from militant combatants, Coca's oil painting and Crisologo's poem ask this dangerous question. What happens when a woman poses as physically and politically proximate to a terruca? Terruca is a local and highly racialized slang for woman terrorists, born from the anti-communist national security doctrines of the Cold War. The Peruvian slang pejoratively implies that a terruca has some degree of indigenous blood, culture, and/or language. Also deployed as a verb, terruquear is the action of casually accusing someone of terrorism. As Rocío Silva Santisteban argues, it is also a form of disposing of her body, a symbolic violence that seeks materialization. In the post-war, it has often been used against those opposing corporate capital in the midst of environmental protests. By turning the verb into its reflexive form using the suffix se, I argue that Coca and Crisólogo elaborate on ideas of becoming a terruca. They appropriate the operation and cancel its exteriority. Their works interrogate race and embrace an aesthetics of women's violence. While having different connotations, chola and terruca are still both within the semantics of the insult. No one wants to be associated with a term, with these both terms. In that sense, the writer José Carlos Agüero poses a critical question in 2015, pointing to the possibility of something shared with former militants, a question that many sectors of the Peruvian society do not want to face. Why not starting by accepting that we stand before some persons that we could consider, if not the same as us, at least very similar to us? A feminist 2000s archive shows us that Coca and Crisólogo rehearsed a response to this question at a time dominated by Alberto Fujimori's regime repression. Media portrayals and dominant cultural representations of subversives aided in foreclosing any possible connections amongst women. In literature, a rewriting of old colonial tropes about sexually available cholas and fanatical communist Indios were at the service of Criollo nationalism. These align with the ever-present global demand to reread Latin America as an inherently violent region south of the border. And here we can locate some famous fictions such as Vargas Llosa, Death in the Andes, or Alonso Cueto, The Blue Hour, Santiago Roncagliolo's Red April, for example. In Coca's self-portrait, Boomerang, we see her wearing short hair and dressed in camouflage. One hand is sensing a fist while the other one holds a grenade close to her mouth. The pin is ready to be pulled. One of her finely plucked eyebrows is defiantly arched upwards. She has no fear in looking directly at the spectator. Her anger, resolution, and provocation control the visual assemblage, setting into motion what I argue is the chola's female masculinity. Since women did not routinely participate as soldiers in the Peruvian army during the war, the self-portrait clearly suggests she belongs to the insurgency. 6 ronderas in black and white are placed in the back of the image. These are the women who fought in the peasant patrols. They wear what is considered indigenous attire that identifies them with the historical category of India. 3 of them are carrying Winchester rifles distributed by the state. I read the relation between foreground and background not as concealing differences between cholas and Indias, but as a visual procedure that highlights possible political convergences. Coca's 2002 centering of ronderas as a capable militia was unprecedented. They were seldom mentioned in scholarship, and their appearance in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not so much as soldiers, but as the women associated with the opacest subject of the war, the ronderos. For no other actor in the war was the dividing line between perpetrator and victim, hero and villain, as thin as porous as for the self-defense committees or counter-subversive peasant patrols. Their attitude during the war, their subordination to the armed forces, the stubbornness with which they declined to surrender weapons, their unquestionable contribution to the military defeat of the Shining Path, and therefore to the reestablishment of peace, has caused contradicting opinions. Peacemaker for some, killers for others, they represent inquietude for everyone. The passage is rich in its use of affixes to define what the Commission feels about the peasant patrols, finishing with their effect on everyone, inquietude, as in physical or mental restlessness or disturbance. This not knowing what to think and what to do with the indios resonates with the long-standing Criollo anxiety to define and control indigenous masses. This anxiety has permeated the most violent practices during colonial and Republican times. Coca deliberately situates ronderas in the public space of the town, especially when we think that the most iconic image of a rondera is this photo that photojournalist Paul Vallejos reproduced everywhere, in which we can see the rondera as this domestic anonymous guardian of the household, attached to the household, right? So by centering ronderas as soldiers, the painting destabilizes the narrative of peasant men fighting alone for the nation, also unveiling the fantasy of a nation that includes indigenous people as agents of victory in the war. Secondly, the superimposing of a subversive woman, the politicized subject par excellence, invokes the idea of the politicization of ronderas. In fact, scholar Olinda Quispe is conducting ethnographic work with ex-ronderas, some of whom also declare themselves as ex-subversives. One of them recalls that other combatants in the Shining Path taught her to read and write, making possible her later involvement in community politics. The party's teachings also trained her in public speech and to not give in to the machismo of the men who disavowed women's intervention in post-war communal assemblies. Despite the Shining Path paternalistic views, the acknowledgement of militancy by ronderas disquiets notions of victimhood and domesticity long assigned to peasant women. Here I would go from this visual account to the literature of Roxana Crisologo. The poem, I Remember Her Cheap and Tight Jeans, indexes the memory of a classmate, Ludi De, a young migrant Chola belonging to the Shining Path. I remember her cheap and tight jeans, her unadorned pinkish white fitted blouses. I remember her tabloid magazine, her little Cusqueña purse, hanging across her like a wool machine gun. I remember her Hawaii t-shirts, her Mickey Mouse tees. I remember the desire with which she looked at handsome white guys of the avant-garde, Jose's long and curly hair. To the Catholics, impeccable of mind, to those skinny ones full of goodness like a flag, to the John Lennon half of their noses, how much she loved and also hated them. She who deliberately initiated herself into the anarchist apprenticeship of this section, sometimes inclined to demolish their shadows. How she looked at herself and how she looked at me, and how, expectorating half of her body, a paradise denied to the nakedness, she parked in the fathomless deserts of Lima. I remember her during a day in which the rural traffic of a truck left her alone in the island world of vegetables, in the blue and baptismal rust of a tuner of strings, in the pubic hair of her palms, in the hypnotic city. And I dream about her inhabiting a city of strings. Do not get close to her, do not say it to her, do not tell her, do not touch her. The music was the same, shred everything but her hate, everything but that which separates us. Incinerate her love, leave her with something to slice, for her to say she thinks about herself and she is afraid. When she lets out her hair and a steely note from the maxillary back of her neck grows like a muscle in her skin. And she sees herself, chola-like, street-like, childlike, stupid, listening to the nosy one, to that one designated by the general direction of the party, to that multitude that separates us. Clothing triggers a racial, sexual, and political vignette that situates Ludi, the poem's speak, that situates Ludi in the city of Lima. The poet's speaker composes a local university scene, demystifying the image of a combatant solely possessed by the central party discourse. The mundanity of Ludi's body disavows the typical representation of Senderista women as monstrous fanatics, repressing any kind of bodily urgency, especially the ones tainted by poor political consciousness. Ludi gives in to her interracial, interclass sexual desire. The poem skillfully reconstructs the micropolitics of race and class between students from the public San Marcos University and the private Catholic University. With Catholics impeccable in mind, the voice refers to the status held by these students, whiter, more affluent, and with better access to formal education. Ludi is one of those San Marcos migrant students coming from rural Peru, affected by financial, social, academic, and racial disadvantages. We can also read their impeccable minds verbatim in regard to the colonial Catholic legacies. The white students are not capable of sin from the Latin impeccabilis, in contrast to the cholas acting out their dirty animalistic constitution. There is no good translation for this diminutive of white into English, blanquitos. As is customary, context determines if the suffix carries endearment or belittlement. The speaker plays with this ambivalence, holding whiteness as the object of desire, while asserting the character's simultaneous despisal of it, how much she loved them and also hated them, sometimes inclined to demolish their shadows. In the collective memory of the war, San Marcos is fixed as a space occupied by the shining path, walls filled with political graffiti, terrorized student body, and professors who openly recited Guzman's scientific Marxism. This was part of the academic life of the 80s and 90s, and its memory has only served to reinforce the image of the Catholic University as an upper-class academic space sanitized of violence. Both universities are in fact separated only by a few city blocks. The poem gestures towards a representation of this vicinity as a way to think about the racial and class violence before and during the war. It invites us to think about universities as public spaces subsumed in colonial practices. Their colonial and ecclesiastical history resonates with the stories of royal decrees in the case of San Marcos and limeño haciendas in the case of the Catholic University. For example, the land of the Catholic University was donated by this ultra-Catholic and racist intellectual, José de la Riva Agüero, who wrote that Indians were incapable of intellectual work and they were only fit for labor in the land and for war. In that sense, both women are stranded in relation to the university as an institution. Ludi represents a figure historically constructed in opposition to it. Her readiness to fight in the first lines of the poem comes from the incarnation of knowing that rejection drives her experience in the university and in the city. She represents the out-of-placedness that is inherent to being a young migrant Chola, and she is ready to kill to make sense of it all. In the poem, white masculinity takes a secondary role as an object of observation and depiction. Contrary to what happens in the literature written by urban men that focus on their sexual use of Chola, representing them as opportunistic. In this literature, men trick them, the Cholas, into sex under the false promise of love, marriage, and social mobility. Within the racially hierarchized public life of the university, the poem does not register men's desire and focuses instead of the urges of the Chola herself. The action concentrates in that complex we of the Chola, of both characters, Ludi and the lyrical I, whose racialized condition can be apprehended through the fact that she occupies a position capable of looking at, perceiving, and empathizing with Ludi's subjectivity. In other words, they inhabit a Cholangness together. In Chrysologus' poetic depiction, the recreation of a gaze goes beyond the ocular. Following Rivera Cusicanqui's anti-colonial visual methodology, the wandering peripheral gaze that zooms into Ludi is followed by what Cusicanqui calls a bodily perception. The eye of the poem feels her desire, her anger, and the activation of her retaliatory politics. The state of alertness mentioned by Cusicanqui is patent in the relationship. The poem is a tense reading, a language of strings, maxillary bones, and hard looks. The speaker offers an image to almost immediately leave the ocular behind for an embodied visceral counter-knowledge of all that is shared between subversive women and leftist feminists in the space of the university. And here is the moment of recognition. How did she look at herself and how she looked at me and how expectorating half of their body. So their mistrust results from the rarefied politics of race and desire. Their socialist agenda does not silence the social demand of detachment. Do not get close to her. Do not say it to her. Do not tell her. Do not touch her. The social rejection can also be applied against those migrants who show a higher level of inadequacy in their assimilation to the racial norms of the city. In that sense, internal colonialism and survival are here at the center of the poem's poetic's voice in the depiction of Ludi's outfit. It catches the political improperness of her desire for blanquitos. There is a temporal spatial void between Ludi's urges and the look into her own reflection. It is marked by a moment of entering the symbolic through racialization. The specular movement of the black, thick, and we can also imagine long indigenous hair falling down unleashes the uncomfortable realities of one's own indigeneity. A recognition that fully gives in to an imagination of Chola as bitch, muscle, mane, pubic hair in her hands as she is carrying her sex out in the open, appear in these stanzas to prepare the conditions for acholada, achorada, aniñada, Chola-like, street-like, childlike. The ellipsis of this line intensifies the emotional tension of a racial recognition devoid of revelation. There is no knowledge in the other's look, no space for self-knowledge either. The prefix a in the likeness of serves to turn the nouns chola and niña into adjective. The poetic scene works in the efficiency of internal racism as a discipline in discourse, one capable of triggering ancient fears, even in those trained as class combatants. Achorada, on the other hand, works as an adjective in this enumeration, but is also a noun. It refers to the achorado guy, an extremely localized urban type, the grifter. He aggressively imposes himself in order to endure poverty, making a strategic use of transgression, machismo, and rampant individualism. The achorado is considered a loud guy with a licentious use of obscenities, an extremely codified argot, and a violent body language. He performs a conscious resistance against communication and seeks to control language as a space only for those initiated as lumpen. He has been read as a neoliberalist subjectivity intensified by the lack of national identity, as a creative performance of a street survival within the socially cannibalistic dynamics of Lima, or as a mere sign of decadence that calls for the corrective intervention of intellectuals. In the case of Ludi, achorada is a problematic word insofar as Marxist combatants define themselves in total opposition to the lumpen proletariat. In my interpretation, Crisologo's choice of achorada gives nuance to Ludi as a subversive, elaborating on a more contingent trajectories of the war. It also works on the total and significant change of meaning of these concepts when they are applied to women. As we have seen, achorado is a male character per se. Women cases go almost unregistered in the popular imagination. In that sense, Ludi recognizes herself as achorada in a class dimension, as someone who is and looks poor, and on a symbolic dimension, as a chola insolent in her speech and gaze. A certain sense of performing a violent masculinity plays a role here. Ludi's sexual urges are misplaced for her gender. Ludi's figure points towards the lack of representational space for the chola body that has its own aggressive desires. The woman's mediation of the poem elaborates on transference precisely because of the speaker's investment in demonstrating separation. I would go on to argue that the lyrical I is much more compliant to racial and class positionalities in the city. Her way of introducing Ludi's appearance and demeanor shows her negative judgment against the provincial girl. The speaker critiques the tastelessness of her tight, desirable cholita outfit, presupposing that she dresses to sexually please white men. The young chola doesn't quite know how to fit herself into an urban look. She makes her migrant origins too visible. Within the mixture of Western pieces and indigenous accessories, it is precisely the little Cusqueña purse that is the first metaphor for the armed struggle, her wool machine gun. Ludi's richness as a character rests in the fact that she radically contradicts one-dimensional depictions of senderistas. For the rigid imagination created by media and culture, it was unthinkable to dress them with products of the decadent US empire, and or picture them reading tabloids. Her name itself, Ludi, has no provincial origins. It sounds exactly like an Anglicism. There is no alias to designate her as a proper comrade. Crisologo is one of the first writers to delve into the representation of non-stereotypical forms of communist militancy. A desire of closeness between the two characters tenses up their mutual rejection. Ludi's ever-present multi-directed hate is problematic for the lyrical eye. Nonetheless, she is impossible to avoid. Her hate is a key component to understand both women and their truncated yet potential alliances. The poetic voice recognizes a preciousness and a productivity in Ludi's hate as what needs to remain, something that belongs and defines her, and to that extent as an affect and a drive that completes the meaning of a shared experience. In this talk, I have argued that there is a feminist archive that has transgressed dominant interpretation of armed women in order to think about race and feminism. Building from my analysis of Boomerang, and I remember her cheap tie jeans, I suggest there is a provocative appropriation of subversive violence as a political tool, now useful for women's struggles in the post-war. This is significant as it converges with the scholarly argument that a trans-feminist epistemology uses the memory of other insurrections and incorporates them into its present forms of political thinking. That's the end of the talk. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I don't know whether you can hear me. I think you can hear me now. Please join me in a round of applause or applause emojis for Dr. Rodriguez. Thank you so much for your presentation. And we have lots of time for sort of questions, observations. I think I said at the beginning, in case you came in late, I had disabled the chat because I use cybersecurity people, got me a little paranoid, but I think I managed to reconnect it. So you might be able to do questions via chat, but in the meantime, I think I'll let Olga sort of call on whoever you see sort of raising a hand, or if anybody wants to jump in and talk, and we'll just kind of see how the conversation flows here. I'll do what I can to manage the technology. Maybe, let's see.
And I'll do my best to see everyone and not to miss anyone's hand.
For those of you who have to leave, thank you again. Thank you very much for coming, and we'll be in touch. Happy March.
Yes, Meredith?
Thank you, Olga. That was such an amazing talk. As someone who does transgender studies, I always am interested in what you mean by trans feminism. So could you elaborate on that and what you mean by trans feminism?
Yes. So I'm basically using the definition that Sayak Valencia uses for defining trans feminist struggles in the Latin American region. So the term incorporates transgender women, and it also incorporates transnational. It thinks about feminism as a transnational movement, but not only that, she talks about these ideas of the transient. So she's looking into migration, for example, and all of the liminal spaces, subjectivities, subject formations that compose the Latin American region. And in that sense, she's also thinking of an extremely localized, historicized, contextualized practice. So rather than having a precise political agenda, what she is thinking is that it's a very kind of localized struggle that needs to use self-criticism as a constant tool to build alliances amongst feminists. And it's more of it's a project that it's more about thinking about the limits of feminism rather than thinking about, rather than defining feminism as one thing or the other. Olympia?
Again, thank you so much for the interesting talk. I was wondering what you think about how the politics or narratives of mestizaje play into these ideas. Because on the one hand, you mentioned with cholas, you have this whole negative connotation that goes back to the colonial period, where the women that, you know, the traidoras, the ones that slept with white men, these kinds of things, like the figure of the Malinche in Mexico. But on the other hand, in the painting that you showed us, what is it called, Boomerang, it seems like the Chola is right at the center. And like you said, the women that are more visually marked as racialized are the indigenous women behind her. So is she trying to kind of intervene in the sense like here you have the Chola, the mixed, woman, the mixed body, leading these violent armed insurrection? Like how are politics of mestizaje figuring into everything that you're analyzing?
Yeah, so for example, there is this long array of all of these terms, right? That, theories as Aníbal Quijano or Sylvia Winter, like they all converge into the idea that all of this name as this category, I mean, the Inca Garcilaso himself talks about how all of this terminology is born with the conquest and with the colonial rule. So what I look, and I might look into Garcilaso and the colonial is also through Aníbal Quijano's and the 80s, right? And this process of cholificación that he talks about, meaning how rural Peruvians are coming to the city of Lima, and like you said, they are the traitors. The cholos are the traitors to their own race, right? And they are also suspicious for white people, right? So the cholo is always this character that is, to use terms from Black studies, this character that is plastic, right? So there are points in which the chola as a woman becomes the center of a national discourse for intellectuals. For example, in classical music, there is this famous piece called Cholita, which appeals to like an endearing look of the chola, but again, as someone in which the national project can take some profit off, like meaning we need to look at chola, to chola's beauty in order to like praise the character, and like because she's the one producing mestizos and cholos for the nation, right? So in that sense, that there is some overlapping in mestizaje and cholificación, but I mean, as it happens in the Mexican case and in the cases throughout the region, I feel like mestizaje in Peru has still this very, it falls into respectability politics, right? Is this very correct form of talking about oneself as a mixed person, right? Because mestizo is, as Rivera Cusicanqui says, is attached to property, is attached to the state, right? Is the good side of mixing, while cholo is still a stigmatized figure. So in that sense, mestizaje and cholo communicate to a certain extent. And in the painting, yes, there is racialization works differently in peasant women than in cholas, but it's not like, I don't feel like there is, like, I don't feel like there is a kinder way of racializing cholas and Indias, So there are many points in Peruvian history and many texts, like literary texts, in which it's the political discourse, the genderizing and the sexualizing of cholas and Indias is as harsh. Hi, yes. Jeff, I didn't recognize you for a moment.
Yeah, I'm getting old. So I wanted to push you a little bit further on the question of mestizaje and cholos. So one of the distinguishing characteristics of mestizaje, say in Nicaragua, where I studied it, or to some degree in Mexico, or to a large degree in Mexico as well, is that it stands for a kind of national identity. that one is almost by definition mestizo or mestiza in Nicaragua or Mexico. So what I'm wondering is how would or could that work in Peru? I mean, is there I mean, and for that matter, would it be in a positive development to forge a national identity based on, let's say, the Cholo or Chola? So start with that. I have perhaps a follow-up, but I wanted to start with that one.
Yes, I mean, Marisol de la Cadena works on the various moments in which mestizaje becomes part of the national discourse to incorporate this notion of incorporation and assimilation of mestizos, of people who define themselves as mestizos, but also to possibly incorporate indigenous masses, right? So there are many points in which in history, mestizaje is also a form of assimilation, right? For the left, for leftist intellectuals and for right-wing intellectuals too, I mean, that's a very dream of Vargas Llosa, for example, right? Like, let the indigenous or make the indigenous leave their archaic beliefs behind and become all mestizos, become all urbanized, because there's this notion that the mestizo, as well as the cholo in that sense, are mostly urban subjects. And you know, there are moments in indigenista literature was one of those big forces in the 1920s where these intellectuals, Valcárcel, they were trying to go back to the Indio, but also, and the Indio always thought through the Inca Empire, right? It's not the Indio that, it's not the peasant Indio, it's like the grandiose legacies of the Inca Empire. So yeah, there are various moments in which mestizaje becomes part of the national discourse. But during the war, for example, it was nowhere to be seen, mestizaje itself, right? It was either, like, people weren't talking about mestizos. Like, people can define themselves as mestizos, but the urgency of the war language was posed in indigenous people again, right? Through this figure of los ronderos, right? The peasant who fought against Shining Path. And there are in the press and in the media that talks about subversive women and subversive men, and they do portray them as mestizos. And you know, in a more harsher day-to-day political discourse, they were also cholos and cholas. So yeah, mestizaje has played a vital role to define national identity, but not to the extent that I think it played a vital role in Mexican tradition through the revolution, for example.
Just one quick follow-up on that.
Just to keep the flow going. So I think Jeff has a follow-up, and then after Jeff, I think I saw a hand from Riley and then from Christina. So Jeff, sorry to cut you off. Please go continue, and then we'll hear from Riley and then Christina. Christy.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on that. Is there any hint or any kind of development of a movement of Cholo, you know, identification, but in the way that we see throughout Latin America, movements which combine identity politics with demand for ends to discrimination, for basic rights and so on. So is there anything analogous that goes on within, let's say, the population that could be identified as cholos and cholas in Peru? Is there anything that resembles those kinds of movements of African descendant peoples or indigenous people?
Yeah. So the term has become a lot more apparent, a lot more present in the post-war. So with urban migration in the 90s, all through the 40s and 80s, migration of rural Peruvians to the city of Lima that intensified because of the violence of the war, Cholo became the paradigmatic political figure, right? The subject to define for leftist, right-wing intellectuals. And in that sense, that there was this weight posed on Cholos as subjects that were gonna make the change, right? Like they were gonna organize, they were already organizing in different forms, but basically to survive. But the hope, for example, for leftist intellectual was that they were going to organize and reshape institutions and all of that, right? So then with migrations come all these ideas of informalidad, informality that are totally defining of Cholo subjectivity, right? So the Cholo is this subreptitious character, this character that is difficult to define, that moves around in the city, that changes professions and changes occupations, that listens to cumbia, to Peruvian cumbia, for example, right? And in that sense, after the war, there was an attempt to define lo cholo attached to what intellectuals define as chicha culture. So meaning estrident kind of imagery, like something that comes from, for example, flyer concerts of cumbia, that it's like bright pink and bright yellow and bright green and all crazy, right? And that has been totally co-opted by the market, like extremely. There's extreme co-optation of Cholo aesthetics by the market, right? And in that sense, I guess the proudness of being Cholo comes from that, being able to consume Cholo objects, right? Or like calling oneself Cholo power or Chola power, where like the pairing with the English word is totally telling on how it works as a neoliberalist trend, right? It's Cholo power as in the convergence of global notions of like market and citizenship and Cholo-ness. And on the other hand, what I argue in my book is that you have Chola feminists who are the ones doing a critical take on this, they are not using it as a market tool, but they are using Chola to think about their own racialization as women and their own place, because the Cholo doesn't have the same place as the Chola, right? There is an insidious violence against the Chola that we see in Peru in all kinds of forms, symbolic, but also physical, like all this like proliferation of feminicides, this like really, the right-wing discourses now that we are in election times have really harshened in the sense that there is this extreme desire to control women's bodies through criminalization of abortion and just saying that pretty much women are the ones, and cholas for that matter, are the ones guilty if they suffer any kind of sexual violence. So the feminists are the ones who are doing the work in the terms of, I wouldn't say identity politics, because none of this has translated into legislation, as it has been in the Argentinian case. But there is a movement towards that. There is a movement towards going to the streets and getting stuff done in terms of law.
Okay, well.
So let's hear from Riley, who had your hand up, and then from Christy.
Yes, hello. Thank you for speaking today. I appreciate it. I'm a student studying with actually Professora Rosenthal, and this conversation has really opened up my eyes to more cultures, and especially Peruvian history. And I would just like to know if you have any suggestions for like kind of beginning to learn about like the history of Cholas, and just like any kind of resources to really kind of start that independent kind of like researching, like any documentaries or books, or perhaps your own book coming soon. But yeah, I just would like to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Riley, for your question. And yes, definitely. We don't have the chat, but I can share the screen again. And there is this Afro-Peruvian woman talking about the topics that I'm analyzing here right now and in my book. Do you see the share screen?
We can also make this the slides available too.
Yeah. So her name is Yana, Y-A-N-N-A. That's the first thing that comes to mind, because you can just put it on YouTube and like see her video, and she's amazing. And also something that comes to mind too is Jose Maria Argueda's Deep Rivers. So it's a very kind of canonical text. It's a text that has been read in multiple ways. It's a beautiful text. It has elements of Quechua language. It's basically kind of a autobiographical experience of the writer. And it also has this amazing chapter in which we can see Chola's uprising. So there is this amazing chapter where like women that prepare chicha, which is alcoholic beverage, women that are considered to be prostitutes because they work in a peasant bar, they organize and they demand political change in their town. I think that's I always love that, reading that novel.
Thank you so much.
Christy, are you still with us? I know you have to take off in a sec.
Yeah, unfortunately I do have to take off, but Olga, I will get my comments to you privately, but mostly since I just have 1 second here, I'll just congratulate you on what I thought was a really terrific talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Christy.
Thank you. So next I think was Nicole, and then Heather.
Okay. Olga, thank you for a terrific talk, and also for just such a wide-ranging Q&A. Your theoretical breadth and your historical and empirical contextualization is really impressive. Mm-hmm. I have so many questions. I don't know which ones to put on the table, but maybe I guess I'll go with two. First of all, I was curious when you're reading these objects, Ludi's, the poem about Ludi especially, because the first one is very obviously a self-portrait as you read it. But why in the poem do you not read either object identification or object desire? why don't you think this is in part the author describing herself? And why don't you read lesbian desire into it? But I see both of those things in there really strongly, but you were really taking the position that it was a sort of a third person looking at Ludi and evaluating. And so that's the first question. And then the second question, you've already gone here a little bit, but I'd just love to hear some more. You've given us in the talk 2 pieces of like basically high art, right? A painting and but even though they're both crossover in the ways that they exercise their artistry. But I'd love to hear more about the relationship between this art and more formally, more conventionally high art, and but much more interesting to me, this art and pop culture. So how does this, which is maybe also to bring in Jeff's question about relationship to social movements as well, because I'm interested in sort of how does this art fit into the ways in which people who are living these political currents, who share identitarian elements, identifications, to the ways that they are experiencing their world through culture.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nicole. Yeah, definitely. I thank you so much for the lesbian desire thing, which is totally there. But I haven't gotten into it. The thing about self-identification plays a bigger role in my chapter, where I look into the case of a video that Crisólogo collaborated in collaboration with Karen Bernedo, who's a curator and an artist. They put a video together, presented in various places, and put it in YouTube. They interviewed feminist scholars. They interview other people that were part of that same experience with Ludi in San Marcos. They, in the video, talk about a lot more about Ludi as real character, let's say, right? Like someone they knew. And they talk about how Ludi killed herself because of the party. She was carrying dynamite, and she had to perpetrate an attack, an operation, and she killed herself in that gruesome way, right? And in the video, there is a lot more about self-identification, and I do the analysis in the chapter where I look a lot into like how, yes, Crisólogo is talking about herself through Ludi, and I wanted to convey some of that here in the talk today, but there's also this rejection that happens because of internal colonialism too, and there is always this tension between both of them. And in the video, it's very clear how they were thinking about themselves in order to. They were talking about Ludi, but all of the women interviewed in the video were thinking about themselves. And in that sense, in the YouTube comments of the video are horrible, because, you know, men start calling them terrucas. You guys are all whores. You're horrible people. These people kill peasants, and these people kill and so, and you guys are defending them. How can you dare, right? So there was definitely at this point in time, 2006, and even now, like a lot of these are very contentious subjects, right? And the artists and the activists who talk about these kind of things receive a lot of violence through media. And I would definitely incorporate this homoerotic lesbian desire. Like, I think it's totally appropriate. Now that you brought it up, thank you for that. I think that was a missing thing for sure. And on the other part, how there is this mix between high art and popular culture and social movements. And I think it happens organically through activism, because all of the women whom I'm working with, Coca, Crisólogo, all of them have had a very active activist agenda. Coca in this collective called Sociedad Civil in the 90s, where they were doing all kinds of performances to raise critical awareness against the Fujimori regime and how Fujimori was a dictator. And in the case of Crisólogo, she's part of Comando Plaf. And she's part of, she lives in Finland, and over there she's part of a poet association of migrants in that region of the world. So I think it all comes together in terms of, my objects are high art in this part, but then when I go to Winnie Minerva, for example, who is like a transient subject because she does high art, but also she works a lot with social media and social media interventions that are not at all, that don't have a high art audience, that are very, she's playing with people constantly, with interaction. And Yana is part of popular culture component too, the Afro-Peruvian musician. And yeah, I think that's, and Chola Contravisual. I think that there is a lot of, there is a hugely, a very important countercultural component of this, in these activisms too. Thank you so much.
So we're almost to the end of our allotted time. Let's hear from Heather, and then Olga, you can have the last word.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I'm also a student under Professora Rosenthal. And I was wondering about the transfeminism that you were mentioning. I'm very interested in sociology and social movements. And I was wondering how that looks practically. We're talking about that being transnational and kind of trans-organizational and very inclusive. And so I was wondering, like, what organizations does that entail? How do they work together and that sort of thing? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, Heather, and thanks to Olympia again for inviting her students. So I just wrote a piece about that, and basically since 2016, 2016 is a very important year for region-wide feminist uprisings, right? Before it started in Mexico, it became super prevalent in Argentina, and the Peru has its own rendition to it. And it's, I love your question in the sense that it's like, it's one of the parts that I love the most about this movement, is because it's extremely, there's a lot of conflict amongst these feminists, right? And it has worked in different ways. It started in 2016 to denounce the lack of punishment for men who wanted to kill women, and it's basically this guy was beating his girlfriend, and he received no punishment for it. So that started this sense of collective indignation, right? Like, and it organized through Facebook. That's another important thing. It organized through Facebook, the Ni Una Menos, not one less, right? So one thing that Sayek Rivera emphasizes with her transfeminism is that the most important political claim for feminists in Latin America is to not get killed, right? To not be murdered by your partner, by your family, by the state, by the gangs, right? At that kind of thing, like to not be murdered centers their political density, right? But there has been points in which it's not only that, and it's not only denouncing sexual assault, but it's also incorporating abortion into the agenda, right? In the Peruvian case too, in the Argentinian case, in Chile also. And it's also incorporating anti-capitalist demands, right? So basically, how are we going to take care of each other, or what do we need from the state to not live this precarious life? That it's all interconnected, right? Patriarchal violence with capitalist violence in these cases. The ones who started the meetings were women were intellectuals and artists, white intellectuals and artists, the ones who started the meetings. And then all these other colectivas emerged, right? All these collectives, but they call themselves not colectivos, like in the proper Spanish way, but they change it into feminine, right? Colectivas. So all these other collectivas emerge of women in popular sectors, basically brown women, indigenous women, Chola women, and they fought against the white feminists that were controlling the means of, they were controlling everything, you know, like organizing, like the time of the marches, like how the marches were gonna go in the city and all of that. So it looks promising to me. We also have right now a transgender candidate for the Congress, the first in Peruvian history, who comes from rural Peru. And I feel that there is a lot more space to talk about these things within a national context, but within a regional context, and it crosses with other hemispheric, you know, struggles in very interesting ways. It certainly promises. I don't think any of this would have happened if it wasn't for women uprising in 2016. Thank you.
So with that, I guess we're about out of time. So thank you so much to everybody for coming, and thanks to Olga for a wonderful presentation
So much.
and for all of the patient Q&A. I guess, I don't know how easy it is to get in touch with you, Olga, to continue the conversation, but we'll be happy to share contact information if anybody would like to keep the conversation going in other formats or circumstances. So thank you, everybody, and have a really great weekend. Cheers. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank